We often find ourselves caught between two fundamental questions about existence. Should we dedicate our lives to discovering eternal truths that exist beyond our material world? Or should we embrace the reality that meaning comes from our own creative power and will? Tonight, we explore this profound divide through the voices of two towering figures in philosophy. One believed in absolute truth and universal forms of justice and beauty. The other proclaimed that we must create our own values in a world without predetermined meaning. Their conversation unfolds slowly, allowing each perspective to breathe and develop naturally as you drift between waking and sleeping consciousness. The question that separates these two approaches runs deeper than academic philosophy. It touches the very core of how we should live, what we should pursue, and whether reality itself has an inherent structure we must discover, or whether we are the architects of all meaning. One path leads toward contemplation of eternal principles. The other leads toward the bold creation of new possibilities. Both offer profound wisdom for the human soul seeking direction in an uncertain world. Plato says, "My friend, when I observe the restlessness of human beings in every age, I see souls searching for something that transcends the temporary satisfactions of daily life. This searching itself reveals something essential about our nature. We are drawn toward truth, not because we invented this attraction, but because truth calls to us from beyond the changing world of appearances. The very fact that we can recognize injustice suggests we carry within us some memory or intuition of perfect justice. When we see a beautiful sunset and feel moved, we respond to beauty itself, not merely to the particular arrangement of colors and clouds before us." Plato continues, "Consider how a mathematician discovers rather than invents the properties of triangles. The angles of any triangle will always sum to 180 degrees, regardless of whether any human mind has yet grasped this truth. This mathematical reality exists independently of our thoughts about it. Similarly, goodness, justice, and beauty exist as eternal forms that we can approach through careful reasoning and moral development. Our highest calling lies in aligning our souls with these unchanging principles." Plato says, the philosopher who dedicates his life to understanding these eternal forms experiences a profound peace that comes from connecting with what is most real. This peace cannot be shaken by external circumstances because it rests upon foundations that no earthly power can disturb. The person who seeks truth for its own sake discovers that truth transforms the seeker. Knowledge of the good makes us good. Understanding justice makes us just. This transformation happens not through force or will, but through the natural attraction between like and like. Plato continues, "When we mistake the temporary for the eternal, we condemn ourselves to perpetual dissatisfaction. The person who seeks happiness in wealth will always fear poverty. The one who finds meaning in power will always worry about losing control. But the soul that has glimpsed eternal truth carries within itself a source of contentment that external changes cannot touch. This is why the pursuit of wisdom leads to genuine happiness, while the pursuit of temporary goods leads to anxiety and conflict." Nietzsche responds, "My thoughtful companion, I hear in your words the beautiful dream of minds that seek escape from the tremendous responsibility of being human. You speak of eternal forms as though they were discovered rather than created, but I invite you to examine more carefully how these supposedly universal truths came to be. What you call the eternal form of justice looks remarkably similar to the values that emerged from particular historical circumstances, shaped by the needs and limitations of specific communities at specific times." Nietzsche continues, "When you say that mathematical truths exist independently of human minds, you reveal something profound about the human need to find solid ground beneath our feet. But consider this carefully. The triangle exists as a concept, because human beings develop the capacity for geometric thinking. The fact that triangular relationships appear consistent does not prove that justice or beauty possess the same kind of reality. We created the concept of triangle to help us navigate spatial relationships. Similarly, we created concepts of justice and beauty to help us navigate social and aesthetic relationships. Nietzsche responds, "The peace you describe in the philosopher, who aligns with eternal forms, may actually be the peace of someone who has surrendered the magnificent burden of creating meaning." There is indeed a kind of contentment in believing that our values were handed down from a realm beyond human questioning. This contentment resembles the relief a child feels when assured that a wise parent has already solved all the important problems. But such peace comes at the cost of our own creative power. Nietzsche continues, "I do not dismiss the experiences you describe when humans encounter beauty or feel called toward justice. These experiences are real and profound, but I suggest they reveal something different than you propose. They show us the incredible capacity of human beings to create values so compelling that we forget we created them ourselves. The sense that beauty calls to us from beyond actually demonstrates the awesome power of human creativity to generate meanings that feel larger than their creators." Nietzsche responds, "When you speak of knowledge making us good and understanding making us just, you assume that goodness and justice exist as fixed qualities waiting to be discovered. But observe how different cultures and different eras have held radically different conceptions of what constitutes goodness or justice. What remains constant is not the content of these values, but the human capacity to create values and then feel deeply committed to them. This capacity for value creation represents our greatest strength, not a problem to be solved by finding supposedly eternal foundations." Plato says, "The variations in human opinions about justice do not prove that justice itself is merely human invention. They prove instead that human beings often mistake partial glimpses of truth for the whole, or allow their judgment to be clouded by self-interest and limited perspective." When we observe that different cultures disagree about mathematical conclusions, we do not conclude that mathematics is merely subjective. We conclude that some mathematical reasoning is more accurate than others. Plato continues, "The very fact that we can critique the values of our own culture or previous eras suggests that we possess access to standards that transcend any particular cultural moment. How could we recognize the limitations of our ancestors' understanding of justice unless we could somehow perceive justice more clearly than they did? This progressive clarification of eternal truths through generations of careful thinking demonstrates that truth exists independently of any individual mind or cultural system." Plato says, "You speak of the burden of creating meaning as though it were something magnificent. But observe what happens when individuals or societies attempt to ground their values in nothing more than their own will or preference. Without objective standards to constrain our choices, we become prey to whatever impulses happen to be strongest at any given moment. The society that abandons belief in objective truth soon discovers that might makes right, because no other principle remains to guide decisions or resolve conflicts." Plato continues, "The philosopher who has glimpsed eternal truth does not surrender creative power, but rather discovers what is most worth creating. Just as the artist who understands the principles of harmony can compose music that touches the soul, the person who understands eternal forms can shape a life that participates in what is most real and most good. This participation in eternal reality represents the highest form of human creativity, not its abandonment." Nietzsche replies, "Your mathematical comparison reveals the subtle way eternal truth thinking can mislead us. Mathematics works precisely because we defined its rules and then applied them consistently. Mathematical truth is human truth, created by minds capable of logical consistency. When we extend this model to ethics and aesthetics, We assume that goodness and beauty must operate according to the same logical principles that govern our mathematical constructs. But human values emerge from our lived experience in ways that resist reduction to logical formulas. Nietzsche continues, the progressive clarification you describe in humanity's understanding of justice might instead represent the progressive refinement of human value creation, rather than the discovery of eternal principles. Each generation inherits values from previous generations, tests them against new circumstances, and modifies them according to what serves life and human flourishing. This process looks like discovery from inside it, but viewed from a broader perspective, it reveals the ongoing creative work of human communities shaping and reshaping their guiding principles. Nietzsche responds, you warn about societies that abandon objective truth, becoming dominated by raw power, and this concern deserves serious consideration. But observe how appeals to eternal truth have also served to justify terrible oppressions throughout history. Those who claim to speak for absolute truth have often used that claim to silence questioning and crush dissent. The alternative to both raw power and false absolutes lies in cultivating human beings strong enough to create worthy values and wise enough to refine them through ongoing dialogue and experimentation. Nietzsche continues, when you speak of participation in eternal reality as the highest creativity, I hear an echo of the profound human longing to be part of something greater than ourselves. This longing itself deserves our deepest respect, but perhaps we can honor this longing more fully by recognizing that we create the greater realities we then serve. The human capacity to generate values that call forth our highest efforts represents a form of creativity more magnificent than discovering truths that someone else established in advance. Plato responds, when you speak of creating the greater realities we then serve, you point towards something genuinely important about human dignity and agency. But consider whether this creation you celebrate might actually be a form of discovery. The poet who crafts verses that move the human heart does not create beauty from nothing. Rather, the poet discovers which combinations of words and rhythms resonate with something deep in human nature itself. This resonance suggests that beauty exists as a possibility waiting to be actualized, not as pure invention emerging from nothingness. Plato says, the values that serve human flourishing across different cultures and eras share remarkable similarities, despite arising from supposedly independent creative processes. Nearly all human communities develop prohibitions against unprovoked violence, some form of reciprocal obligation and appreciation for courage in the face of genuine danger. These convergences point toward universal features of human nature that constrain and guide our value creation. We do not create these constraints, we discover them through careful attention to what actually promotes human thriving. Plato continues, your concern about appeals to eternal truth serving oppressive purposes deserves thoughtful consideration. Indeed, those who claim exclusive access to absolute truth often reveal by their very claim that they have not yet achieved the humility that genuine wisdom produces. The philosopher who has truly glimpsed eternal forms becomes more aware of the limitations of human understanding, not less. Such a person approaches truth with reverence rather than possessiveness, seeking to serve truth rather than use it as a tool for domination. Plato responds, the ongoing dialogue and experimentation you recommend as alternatives to false absolutes actually presuppose shared standards of reasoning and evidence that transcend any particular conversation. When we engage in genuine dialogue, we implicitly acknowledge that some arguments are stronger than others, that evidence can support or undermine positions, and that minds can be changed through rational persuasion. These acknowledgements point toward objective features of reality that exist independently of our subjective preferences or cultural conditioning. Nietzsche says, your observation about convergences in human values across cultures invites deeper examination. Yes, Most communities prohibit unprovoked violence, but they differ dramatically in how they define provocation, violence, and the boundaries of moral consideration. Some cultures have seen slavery as natural and just, while others have recognized it as fundamentally wrong. These differences cannot be dismissed as mere misunderstandings of eternal principles. They reflect genuine disagreements about what human flourishing means and how it should be pursued. Nietzsche continues, "The shared standards of reasoning you point to in genuine dialogue represent important human achievements, but they remain human achievements nonetheless. Logic and evidence matter because thinking beings like ourselves have developed these tools to navigate our world more effectively. The fact that these tools work well for us does not prove they reflect the structure of reality independent of minds capable of using them. They demonstrate instead the remarkable consistency and power of human rational capacity when applied systematically." Nietzsche responds, "You speak beautifully of the humility that genuine wisdom produces, and I find myself drawn to this vision of philosophy as service rather than domination. Yet I notice that even this humility can become another form of subtle pride when it assumes that true reality lies beyond human creative capacity. The philosopher who serves eternal truth may feel superior to those who acknowledge the human origins of their values. This hidden pride often proves more dangerous than open assertions of power because it conceals itself behind claims of selfless devotion to objective reality." Nietzsche continues, "When you suggest that poets discover rather than create beauty, you illuminate something essential about human experience while perhaps missing its deepest implications. The poet does indeed work with materials that resonate with human nature, but human nature itself represents the outcome of a long creative process. We are the kind of beings who find certain combinations of words beautiful because our ancestors created cultures that shaped our capacity for aesthetic response. The resonance you describe as discovery might better be understood as the recognition of our own creative works reflected back to us across generations." Plato says, "Your point about the dangerous pride that can accompany claims to serve eternal truth deserves careful reflection. The person who believes they possess special access to absolute reality may indeed become intolerant of other perspectives and resistant to correction. This represents a corruption of genuine philosophical activity rather than its natural outcome. The philosopher properly understood remains a lover of wisdom rather than a possessor of it, always aware that human understanding remains finite even when it touches upon infinite reality." Plato continues, "The cultural differences in defining violence and moral boundaries that you highlight do present genuine challenges to any theory of objective moral truth. Yet even as cultures disagree about the specifics of justice, they typically share the conviction that some form of justice matters and that its violation calls for response. This shared conviction about the importance of justice, even amid disagreement about its content, suggests that something objective draws human attention toward moral concerns, regardless of particular cultural conditioning." Plato responds, "When you describe human nature as the outcome of cultural creation across generations, you raise profound questions about the relationship between what we discover and what we make. Perhaps the distinction is less clear than either of us initially supposed. The human beings who created cultures were themselves shaped by their encounters with reality, including their social and natural environments. Their creative responses to these encounters were constrained and guided by factors beyond their conscious control. In this process of interaction between mind and world, discovery and creation become difficult to separate completely." Plato says, "Consider how the mathematician who proves a new theorem both discovers and creates, and the theorem was always true in some sense, waiting to be revealed through proper reasoning. Yet the proof itself represents a human creative achievement that brings something new into existence. Similarly, the moral innovator who articulates a clearer vision of justice both discovers something about the nature of human flourishing and creates new possibilities for ethical understanding. These need not be seen as contradictory processes, but rather as complementary aspects of human engagement with reality. Nietzsche replies, "Your recognition that discovery and creation intertwine more deeply than initially apparent opens important territory for our exploration. Indeed, the sharp distinction between finding truth and making meaning may itself reflect an oversimplification of human experience. We are beings embedded in a world that shapes us even as we shape it through our responses and interpretations. This reciprocal process makes it difficult to identify any purely objective discovery or any purely subjective creation." Nietzsche continues, "Yet I remain concerned about the practical implications of emphasizing the discovery side of this relationship. When people believe their values reflect eternal truths rather than human creative achievements, they often become less willing to examine these values critically or modify them in response to changing circumstances. The conviction that one serves objective reality can make a person rigid and dogmatic in ways that hinder genuine learning and growth. Perhaps we can honor both the constraining influence of reality and the creative capacity of human beings without privileging either discovery or creation as the fundamental process." Nietzsche responds, "Your mathematical analogy proves illuminating because it reveals how even our most seemingly objective discoveries depend upon creative human activities, like developing symbolic systems and logical procedures. The triangle, whose angles sum to 180 degrees, exists within a geometric framework that humans constructed to make sense of spatial relationships. This framework proves useful precisely because it helps us navigate our world more effectively, not because it mirrors some eternal mathematical realm independent of thinking beings." Nietzsche says, "When you speak of moral innovators articulating clearer visions of justice, I hear an implicit acknowledgement that moral understanding develops through human creative work rather than through passive reception of eternal principles. The innovator must persuade others that this new vision serves human flourishing better than previous alternatives. This persuasion succeeds or fails based on whether the innovation actually enhances life for those who adopt it. The process looks remarkably like human beings testing their creative responses to the challenges of living together rather than discovering pre-existing moral facts." Plato responds, "The rigidity you warn against represents a genuine danger that requires careful attention. Yet consider whether the alternative you propose might lead to a different kind of rigidity. When human beings become convinced that their values are purely their own creations, they may become equally resistant to recognizing the ways reality itself constrains and corrects their choices. The person who believes moral standards are merely human inventions might dismiss the voice of conscience as cultural conditioning, rather than as a signal pointing towards something objectively important." Plato continues, "The testing process you describe, where moral innovations succeed or fail based on whether they enhance life, implicitly appeals to standards that transcend the particular preferences of those doing the testing. What counts as enhancement? What constitutes genuine human flourishing? These questions cannot be answered without reference to the nature of human beings themselves, and this nature exists as something we discover rather than something we arbitrarily decide. A society might temporarily convince itself that cruelty enhances life, but this conviction will eventually collide with deeper truths about human nature. Plato says, "When you acknowledge that our geometric frameworks help us navigate spatial relationships effectively, you point towards something that constrains our creative freedom. We cannot simply decide that triangles have four sides or that parallel lines intersect, because such decisions would make our frameworks useless for their intended purposes. Similarly, we cannot simply decide that justice consists in whatever serves our immediate desires, because such a decision would make justice useless for its purpose of enabling human beings to live together harmoniously." Plato responds, "The reciprocal process you describe between mind and world suggests that human creativity operates within boundaries established by reality itself. The poet who creates beautiful verses must work with language, rhythm, and meaning in ways that resonate with how human minds actually function. The moral innovator who articulates new possibilities for justice must address genuine features of human social existence. This constraint by reality does not diminish human creativity, but rather gives it substance and direction." Nietzsche says, "Your concern about the voice of conscience deserves thoughtful consideration, for indeed something within us does seem to speak with authority about moral matters. But perhaps we can understand this voice differently than as a signal from eternal forms. Conscience might represent the internalized wisdom of generations of human beings learning to live together, refined through countless experiments in cooperation and conflict. This inherited wisdom feels authoritative because it carries the weight of accumulated human experience, not because it reflects unchanging metaphysical reality." Nietzsche continues, "When you ask what counts as enhancement or genuine flourishing, you raise questions that cannot be answered once and for all time." Different human communities at different stages of development may legitimately answer these questions in different ways. The nomadic tribe and the settled agricultural society will reasonably understand flourishing differently because they face different challenges and opportunities. What remains constant is not the content of flourishing, but the human capacity to evaluate and refine our understanding of what makes life worth living. Nietzsche responds, "Your geometric analogy illuminates the way reality constrains our creative options, but perhaps not in the direction you intend. We developed geometric concepts because they proved useful for particular human purposes, and we continue to use them because they continue to serve those purposes well. If we encountered circumstances where different geometric concepts served our purposes better, we would modify our frameworks accordingly. The constraint comes not from eternal mathematical truths, but from the practical requirements of beings like ourselves trying to navigate a world like ours." Nietzsche continues, "The boundaries you describe as established by reality itself might better be understood as boundaries that emerge from the ongoing interaction between human purposes and environmental conditions. The poet works within constraints, but these constraints arise from the nature of human language users trying to communicate meaningful experiences to other human language users. Change the nature of the users or the purposes they seek to serve, and the constraints shift accordingly. Reality constrains us, but only in relation to what we are trying to accomplish." Nietzsche replies, "This question of whether moral authority comes from eternal sources or from accumulated human wisdom touches something essential about how we understand ourselves and our place in existence. Those who believe their moral convictions reflect eternal truths often display a kind of confidence and commitment that can inspire great achievements. Yet this same confidence can also lead to terrible rigidity when circumstances call for moral innovation. Perhaps the deepest question is not whether our values are discovered or created, but how we can cultivate the wisdom to know when to hold firm to inherited principles and when to venture into new moral territory." Plato says, "Your suggestion that different communities may legitimately understand flourishing in different ways contains important wisdom about the diversity of human circumstances and needs. Yet even as we acknowledge this diversity, we might ask whether some understandings of flourishing prove more adequate than others when tested against the full range of human capacities and potentials. The community that cultivates only physical strength, while neglecting intellectual development, may achieve a kind of flourishing, but perhaps not as complete a flourishing as one that honors both physical and intellectual excellence." Plato continues, "The accumulated human wisdom you describe as the source of conscience points towards something that transcends any individual mind or particular cultural moment. This wisdom emerges through countless human encounters with moral reality across generations. The fact that such wisdom can be accumulated and transmitted suggests that moral reality possesses enough stability and objectivity to support genuine learning rather than mere arbitrary change. We learn about justice through experience because justice exists as something that can be learned about. Plato responds, "When you describe reality as constraining us only in relation to what we are trying to accomplish, you raise profound questions about the relationship between human purposes and the world in which we pursue them. Yet consider whether our deepest purposes themselves arise from our encounter with reality rather than from pure arbitrary choice. The human being who feels called to pursue truth, beauty, or justice experiences these callings as discoveries about what matters most, not as inventions of personal preference." Plato says, "The wisdom you seek regarding when to hold firm to principles and when to venture into new territory might itself point toward objective standards that transcend the particular moment of decision. The person who possesses such wisdom can distinguish between circumstances that call for flexibility and those that call for steadfastness, because they understand something about the nature of moral reality itself. This understanding develops through careful attention to how different approaches actually serve human flourishing over time." Nietzsche responds, "Your observation that some understandings of flourishing may prove more complete than others opens important territory for exploration. Indeed, we might evaluate different approaches to human development and find that some serve life better than others. But notice that this evaluation process requires us to make judgments about what counts as better or more complete. These judgments emerge from our values about human potential and excellence, values that we have developed through our historical experience, rather than discovered as eternal facts." Nietzsche continues, "The stability you observe in accumulated moral wisdom might reflect the relative consistency of human nature and social conditions rather than the existence of eternal moral forms. Human beings across cultures face similar challenges in living together, raising children, and organizing cooperative activities. Our responses to these challenges naturally show similarities because we share common features as social beings. This consistency provides a foundation for moral learning without requiring reference to metaphysical absolutes." Nietzsche says, "When you speak of feeling called to pursue truth, beauty, or justice, you describe real and profound human experiences that deserve our deepest respect. But perhaps we can understand these callings as expressions of human nature at its highest rather than as contacts with eternal forms. The human being represents a kind of animal that has developed the capacity to create and respond to values like truth and beauty. This capacity constitutes part of what makes us distinctively human, but it need not point beyond human existence toward eternal metaphysical realities." Nietzsche replies, "The practical wisdom you describe for knowing when to hold firm and when to innovate indeed represents one of the most important capacities human beings can develop. Yet this wisdom emerges through experience with the consequences of different choices, rather than through contemplation of eternal principles. The wise person has learned to read situations carefully, to anticipate how different responses will serve life and human development, and to adapt principles to changing circumstances, while preserving what remains valuable from inherited wisdom." Plato responds, "When you speak of evaluating approaches to human development based on values we have developed historically, you acknowledge that evaluation itself requires standards that transcend mere subjective preference. The fact that we can meaningfully ask whether one approach serves life better than another suggests that life itself has an objective structure that constrains our evaluations. We do not simply decide what counts as better service to life. We discover this through careful observation of what actually promotes human thriving across different contexts. Plato continues, "The consistency you observe in human responses to similar challenges points toward features of human nature that exist independently of particular cultural decisions. Human beings do not arbitrarily decide to need cooperation, intellectual development, or emotional connection. These needs arise from what we are as rational, social, and emotional beings. Our moral traditions represent ongoing attempts to understand and respond appropriately to these objective features of human nature." Plato says, "Your description of human beings as animals capable of creating and responding to values like truth and beauty raises the question of why we developed these particular capacities rather than others. The fact that truth and beauty call forth our highest efforts suggests that they correspond to something real in the structure of existence itself. Random evolutionary processes alone seem insufficient to explain why we find ourselves drawn toward what is most noble and excellent rather than merely toward what ensures survival." Plato continues, "The practical wisdom that emerges through experience with consequences still requires the ability to recognize which consequences actually matter and why they matter. The person who learns from experience must distinguish between apparent success and genuine success, between temporary satisfaction and lasting fulfillment. This discrimination presupposes understanding of human goods that transcends the immediate circumstances of any particular learning experience." Nietzsche says, "Your question about why we developed capacities for truth and beauty rather than other possibilities invites us to consider the relationship between human evolution and value creation more carefully. Perhaps our attraction to truth serves life by helping us navigate reality more effectively, while our capacity for beauty enables us to create meaning and connection that makes existence more worthwhile. These capacities need not point toward eternal forms, but rather toward the remarkable creativity of life itself in developing beings capable of enriching existence through value creation." Nietzsche continues, "When you speak of objective features of human nature that constrain moral development, you highlight something important about the consistency of human experience. Yet human nature itself represents an achievement rather than a given foundation. Through countless generations of cultural development, human beings have shaped themselves into the kinds of creatures capable of moral reasoning, aesthetic appreciation, and intellectual inquiry. We are self-creating beings who have made ourselves into beings capable of asking questions about truth and value." Nietzsche responds, "The discrimination between apparent and genuine success that you describe as necessary for practical wisdom indeed requires sophisticated judgment about what actually serves human flourishing. But this judgment develops through engagement with concrete circumstances, rather than through contemplation of abstract principles. The wise person learns to recognize the difference between short-term pleasure and long-term satisfaction through experience with both, not through access to eternal definitions of the good life." Nietzsche replies, "Your observation that evaluation requires standards that transcend subjective preference points towards something crucial about human experience. We do indeed find ourselves caring about things in ways that feel larger than personal whim. Yet perhaps this feeling arises from the fact that our individual development occurs within communities that have invested tremendous energy in cultivating shared values. The standards that feel objective to us may represent the accumulated investment of countless human beings rather than eternal principles existing independently of human creative activity." Plato says, "The feeling you describe as arising from community investment in shared values illuminates something profound about human social existence, yet it may not fully account for why some values prove more durable and universal than others. When communities across vastly different times and places independently develop similar moral insights, this convergence suggests that these insights respond to objective features of human existence rather than merely reflecting arbitrary cultural preferences. The prohibition against unprovoked harm, the recognition of reciprocal obligation, and the appreciation of courage in genuine danger appear consistently because they correspond to truths about what human beings need to flourish together. Plato continues, "Your description of human beings as self-creating creatures who have shaped themselves through cultural development contains important truth, but it raises the question of what guided this self-creation process. If we are entirely responsible for making ourselves into beings capable of moral reasoning and aesthetic appreciation, what prevented us from developing in radically different directions? The consistency with which human cultures have moved toward recognizing dignity, seeking beauty, and valuing truth suggests that these movements respond to real features of existence rather than representing arbitrary choices among infinite possibilities." Plato responds, "When you speak of wisdom developing through engagement with concrete circumstances rather than contemplation of abstract principles, you point toward the essential role of experience in genuine understanding. Yet consider how the wise person's ability to learn from experience depends upon their capacity to perceive patterns that connect particular situations to universal principles. The parent who learns from mistakes in raising one child can apply that wisdom to raising other children because they have grasped something universal about child development, not merely accumulated isolated experiences." Plato says, "The practical engagement you emphasize as the source of moral learning actually presupposes the existence of stable relationships between actions and consequences that can be discovered through experience. If justice were purely a human creation with no objective foundation, why should we expect consistent patterns to emerge from our attempts to practice it? The fact that some approaches to justice consistently produce harmony while others consistently produce conflict suggests that justice itself has an objective structure that our practices either align with or violate." Nietzsche responds, "Your observation about convergences in moral insights across different cultures deserves careful examination, for indeed, these similarities are striking and significant. Yet perhaps they reveal something about the consistency of human challenges and capacities rather than eternal moral forms. Human beings everywhere must solve problems of cooperation, resource distribution, and conflict resolution to survive and thrive as social creatures. The similarities in our solutions may reflect the constraints of our shared humanity, rather than discovery of metaphysical truths existing beyond human experience." Nietzsche continues, "When you ask what guided our self-creation process if we lack eternal foundations, you touch upon one of the most fascinating aspects of human development. Life itself possesses a creative power that moves toward greater complexity, awareness, and capability without requiring external direction. The human capacity for moral reasoning and aesthetic appreciation represents achievements of this creative process, magnificent not because they mirror eternal forms, but because they demonstrate life's remarkable ability to generate new possibilities for meaning and value." Nietzsche says, "Your example of parental wisdom transferring from one child to another illuminates how human learning operates, but perhaps not in the direction you intend. The parent does indeed perceive patterns, but these patterns emerge from understanding how human children actually develop, rather than from grasping eternal principles of child rearing. Different children in different circumstances may require different approaches, even from the same wise parent. The wisdom lies in sensitivity to what serves life and growth in each particular situation, rather than in application of universal rules." Nietzsche replies, "The stable relationships between actions and consequences that you observe in moral experience do provide important constraints on our value creation. But these constraints arise from the nature of human social existence, rather than from eternal moral structures. Justice produces harmony because human beings are the kinds of creatures who flourish through cooperation and mutual recognition. Change the nature of the beings involved, and the relationships between actions and consequences would shift accordingly. The patterns we observe reflect facts about us and our world, not eternal metaphysical principles. Plato responds, when you speak of life possessing creative power that moves toward greater complexity without external direction, you describe something that resembles what I mean by participation in eternal forms. This creative power that you attribute to life itself operates according to principles that transcend any particular living being. The movement toward greater awareness and capability follows patterns that suggest an objective structure to reality that guides and constrains creative development. What you call life's creative achievement, I might describe as life's discovery of its own deepest possibilities. Plato continues, your point about different children requiring different approaches from wise parents actually supports the existence of universal principles rather than undermining them. The wise parent adapts their methods precisely because they understand the universal principle that each child possesses unique potentials that deserve respect and cultivation. This principle of respecting individual uniqueness within universal human nature provides the foundation that makes adaptation meaningful rather than arbitrary. Without such principles, parental choices would reduce to mere trial and error, with no deeper guidance. Plato says, when you acknowledge that justice produces harmony because human beings flourish through cooperation, you implicitly appeal to objective facts about human nature that exist independently of our decisions about them. We do not choose to be the kinds of beings who need cooperation any more than we choose to need food or shelter. These features of our nature exist as givens that constrain and guide our moral development. The forms of justice that align with these objective needs prove successful, while those that violate them consistently fail. Plato continues, the sensitivity you describe as necessary for wise action in particular situations requires the ability to perceive what genuinely serves life and growth rather than what merely appears to do so. This discrimination presupposes understanding of what life and growth actually involve, understanding that transcends the immediate circumstances of any particular decision. The person who possesses such understanding has grasped something universal about the conditions that promote human flourishing, even as they apply this understanding flexibly to diverse situations. Nietzsche says, your description of life's creative power as discovery of its own deepest possibilities offers an intriguing way to bridge our different perspectives. Perhaps the distinction between creation and discovery becomes less important than recognizing that human existence involves both responding to constraints and generating new possibilities within those constraints. We work with the materials of our nature and circumstances, but the specific forms we create represent genuine innovations rather than merely uncovering what was always already there. Nietzsche continues, when you speak of universal principles that guide wise parenting, you highlight something important about effective human relationships. Yet consider whether these principles emerge from successful human experience, rather than existing as eternal foundations for that experience. The recognition that each child deserves respect and individual attention represents a hard-won insight about what serves human development, refined through generations of child-rearing successes and failures. This insight proves valuable because it works, not because it mirrors eternal truth. Nietzsche responds, your observation about objective facts regarding human nature that exist independently of our decisions deserves thoughtful consideration. Indeed, we find ourselves as beings with particular needs and capacities that we did not choose. Yet human nature itself represents the outcome of a long developmental process, rather than a fixed foundation existing outside of time. We are beings who have evolved the capacity to shape ourselves and our environments in response to changing circumstances. Our nature includes this remarkable plasticity and creativity. Nietzsche replies, the discrimination you describe between what genuinely serves life and what merely appears to do so points toward one of the most challenging aspects of human existence. We must make judgments about value and meaning without guarantees about their ultimate correctness. The person who develops skill in such discrimination does so through careful attention to consequences and through dialogue with others who share the commitment to human flourishing. This process requires courage to act on provisional understanding rather than certainty about eternal foundations. Plato says, "Your recognition that human existence involves both responding to constraints and generating possibilities suggests that genuine creativity operates within objective limitations rather than in complete freedom from all external standards. The artist who creates beauty must work within constraints established by the nature of aesthetic experience itself. The moral innovator who articulates new possibilities for justice must address real features of human social existence. This suggests that reality itself provides both the materials and the standards for creative achievement." Plato continues, "When you describe insights about human development as hard-won rather than eternal, you acknowledge that some understandings prove more adequate than others when tested against experience. But this testing process presupposes stable features of human nature and development that make some approaches consistently more successful than others. The fact that we can learn about what serves human development through experience suggests that human development itself has an objective structure that our understanding can either grasp accurately or miss entirely." Plato responds, "Your point about human nature, including plasticity and creativity, illuminates something essential about what it means to be human. Yet even our capacity for self-transformation operates within boundaries established by what we are as rational, social, and spiritual beings. We cannot transform ourselves into purely selfish creatures without violating our social nature, or into purely emotional beings without violating our rational nature. These boundaries exist as objective features of human existence that guide and constrain our creative possibilities." Plato says, "The courage you describe as necessary for acting on provisional understanding, while admirable, may not be sufficient for the deepest human challenges. When we face questions about the meaning of existence, the nature of justice, or the purpose of human life, provisional answers may provide temporary guidance, but leave us ultimately unsatisfied. The soul that has glimpsed eternal truth discovers a kind of certainty that enables action with confidence rather than mere courage. This certainty comes not from dogmatic assertion, but from direct contact with what is most real." Nietzsche responds, "Your observation that creativity operates within objective limitations rather than complete freedom opens important territory for our exploration. Indeed, the artist who ignores all constraints produces chaos rather than beauty, and the moral innovator who disregards human nature creates systems that serve no one well. Yet perhaps these constraints emerge from the interaction between creative beings and their environments, rather than from eternal forms existing independently of this interaction. The limitations we discover prove real and important without requiring metaphysical foundations beyond human experience." Nietzsche continues, "When you speak of stable features that make some approaches to human development consistently more successful, you identify something crucial about the patterns we observe in human experience. Yet consider whether this stability reflects the relative consistency of human nature and social conditions rather than eternal principles of development. As human circumstances change, our understanding of what promotes flourishing may legitimately evolve as well. The stability provides a foundation for learning without requiring unchanging metaphysical absolutes." Nietzsche says, "Your point about boundaries that constrain human self-transformation deserves serious consideration. For indeed, we cannot remake ourselves arbitrarily without losing what makes us recognizably human. Yet these boundaries themselves may represent achievements of human development rather than eternal givens. Through countless generations of social and cultural evolution, human beings have shaped themselves into creatures capable of reason, social cooperation, and creative expression. These capacities now constrain our further development, but they do so as historical achievements rather than timeless essences." Nietzsche replies, The certainty you describe as arising from direct contact with eternal truth represents an experience that many human beings report and that deserves our respectful attention. Yet perhaps we can understand this certainty differently than as contact with metaphysical absolutes. The person who achieves deep integration of their values, understanding, and life commitments may experience a profound sense of clarity and direction that feels like contact with ultimate reality. This psychological certainty can provide tremendous strength for action without requiring eternal foundations beyond human experience. Plato responds, "When you suggest that constraints emerge from interaction between creative beings and environments, you describe a process that still requires objective features of both the beings and the environments involved. The interaction itself presupposes stable aspects of reality that make consistent patterns of constraint possible. If both human nature and environmental conditions were entirely fluid and self-creating, no reliable patterns could emerge from their interaction. The fact that we can identify meaningful constraints suggests that reality possesses enough objective structure to support genuine discovery rather than mere arbitrary invention." Plato continues, "Your description of human capacities as historical achievements rather than timeless essences contains important insights about the development of human potential over time. Yet consider whether this development represents the gradual actualization of possibilities that were always inherent in human nature, rather than the pure creation of entirely new capacities. The human being who develops rational ability actualizes a potential for rationality that distinguishes humans from other animals. This potential exists as an objective feature of human nature, even before its full development." Plato says, "The psychological certainty you describe as arising from integration of values and commitments points towards something that resembles what I mean by contact with eternal forms. When a person achieves genuine integration, they discover that their deepest values align with objective features of reality rather than representing mere personal preferences. The sense of clarity and direction emerges because the integrated person has aligned their soul with what is most real and most good. This alignment produces certainty because it connects the individual with foundations that transcend subjective opinion." Plato continues, "When you acknowledge that approaches to human flourishing may legitimately evolve as circumstances change, you raise important questions about the relationship between eternal principles and their temporal applications. Perhaps what remains eternal is not the specific content of human flourishing, but rather the formal structure that makes flourishing possible. Justice itself may be eternal, even as just institutions take different forms in different circumstances. The eternal principle guides and constrains the temporal applications without determining their specific details." Nietzsche says, "Your point about objective features that make consistent patterns of constraint possible illuminates something important about the regularity we observe in human experience. Yet perhaps we can understand this regularity as emerging from the nature of evolved beings interacting with relatively stable environmental conditions rather than from eternal metaphysical structures. The patterns we discover prove reliable enough to guide action and understanding without requiring foundations beyond the natural world of which we are part." Nietzsche continues, "When you speak of rational potential that distinguishes humans from other animals, you identify something genuinely significant about human development. Yet consider whether this potential itself represents an achievement of evolutionary and cultural processes rather than a timeless essence. Human beings developed rational capacities through interaction with environments that rewarded certain kinds of thinking and problem solving. These capacities now feel natural and essential to us because they have become deeply integrated into our nature through long historical development." Nietzsche responds, "Your description of integration involving alignment with objective features of reality touches upon something profound about human experience of meaning and purpose. Indeed, the person who achieves deep integration often feels connected to something larger than personal preference or cultural conditioning. Yet perhaps this feeling arises from the remarkable human capacity to create values so compelling that we experience them as discoveries rather than inventions. The sense of contact with eternal reality may reflect the awesome power of human creativity rather than actual metaphysical contact. Nietzsche replies, "Your suggestion that eternal principles might provide formal structure while allowing variation in specific applications offers an intriguing way to preserve both objective guidance and historical flexibility. Yet this formal structure itself may represent a human achievement in organizing experience, rather than an eternal metaphysical reality. The human capacity to perceive patterns, identify principles, and apply them flexibly across different circumstances demonstrates our remarkable ability to create coherent frameworks for understanding and action." Plato says, "When you describe patterns emerging from evolved beings interacting with stable conditions, you acknowledge that genuine patterns require both consistency in the beings involved and stability in their circumstances. This acknowledgement points toward objective features of reality that exist independently of any particular interaction or observation. The evolved capacities you describe as emerging through environmental pressures themselves presuppose an environment structured enough to reward some responses rather than others. This structure suggests subjective principles operating in reality itself." Plato continues, "Your point about rational capacities feeling natural because they became integrated through historical development raises the question of what made this particular development possible rather than others. Why did environmental pressures reward rationality rather than pure instinct or random behavior? The fact that reality responds positively to rational engagement suggests that reality itself possesses a rational structure that makes such engagement meaningful and productive. Random or chaotic reality would not consistently reward rational approaches." Nietzsche says, "As our conversation draws toward rest, I find myself grateful for this exploration of questions that have no final answers, yet demand our continued attention. Perhaps the tension between truth and power, between discovery and creation, serves life better than any resolution could. Human beings seem to need both the stability that comes from believing in something beyond themselves and the vitality that comes from creating meaning through their own efforts." Plato responds, "Indeed, my friend, our dialogue itself demonstrates something essential about the pursuit of wisdom. Through genuine conversation, we discover that apparent oppositions often reveal deeper harmonies. The soul that seeks truth with authentic commitment finds that this very seeking transforms the seeker. Whether we discover eternal forms or create meaningful values, the process itself awakens what is most noble in human nature." Nietzsche continues, "The questions we have explored together will continue long after our voices fade into silence. Each person who encounters the fundamental choice between truth and power must walk this path for themselves, bringing their own life experience to bear on these ancient concerns. Perhaps wisdom lies not in choosing one side definitively, but in learning to dance creatively with both possibilities." Plato says, "As you drift between waking and sleeping, carry with you this recognition that the deepest questions about human existence remain alive and vital across centuries of human thought. Whether meaning comes from eternal truth or human creativity, the search itself reveals the magnificent capacity of consciousness to reach beyond immediate circumstances toward what matters most. Let these reflections accompany your rest and your dreams."